Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're going to dive into a gripping story of love, loyalty, and survival as we uncover whether Jack and Tu Tien can overcome the company's financial collapse after serious bridge construction violations left them unable to even pay the bank interest. Will love be enough to carry them through their darkest chapter? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Jack was still being held for investigation, and with each passing day, the pressure around everyone connected to him seemed to grow heavier. The bridge collapse had already destroyed the company's reputation, shattered public trust, and pushed every person close to Jack into a season of fear and exhaustion. But now, with the police continuing their investigation and refusing to let him go, everything felt even more uncertain. The case was no longer just about a failed structure. It had become a matter of legal responsibility, missing records, material substitutions, and the question of who had truly caused the disaster. And while Jack remained inside, Tu Tien was outside carrying everything she could. At first, she told herself she was strong enough. She told herself she could manage the house, deal with the lawyer, handle the endless questions, and keep moving forward, no matter how tired she felt. She had already forced herself to keep going through the shock of the bridge collapse, the scandal, Jack's detention, and the fear of her pregnancy being affected by all that stress. So now, even though her body was getting weaker day by day, she continued pretending she could still handle it. But the truth was beginning to catch up with her. She was sleeping badly. She was barely eating enough. She was constantly anxious. And because she was pregnant, every bit of emotional pressure felt heavier than before. There were days when she woke up already exhausted. Her head felt light, her chest felt tight, and even simple tasks seemed to drain her. But she still pushed herself. She still answered calls. She still tried to manage paperwork. She still looked for ways to help Jack's case, because as long as he was being held, she could not convince herself to rest. The doctor's warning remained in her mind, but life outside was too harsh to obey it fully. Avoid stress. Avoid overwork. Rest more. Eat properly. To other people, those words sounded reasonable. To Tu Tien, they sounded almost impossible. One afternoon, after another morning spent running between the company's remaining office staff, a lawyer's assistant, and a trip to gather additional documents, Tu Tien came home feeling more drained than usual. The moment she stepped inside, she had to hold on to the table for balance. Her vision blurred for a second, and a wave of weakness ran through her so suddenly that it frightened her. She tried to steady herself. She told herself it would pass. But before she could even sit down properly, her knees gave way. When neighbors found her, she was pale, barely conscious, and too weak to respond properly. They rushed her to the hospital at once. By the time she opened her eyes again, the first thing she noticed was the white ceiling above her and the faint sound of medical equipment nearby. Then came the sharp realization of where she was. The hospital. And immediately after that came the fear. Her hand moved to her stomach before she even fully sat up. The baby. That was all she could think about. When the doctor came in, Tu Tien asked the question before anything else. "My baby, is the baby okay?" The doctor looked at her calmly, then gave the answer she had been praying for without even realizing she was praying. "The baby is fine," the doctor said. "You were brought in because of exhaustion, severe stress, and physical weakness. But so far, there's no sign that the pregnancy has been harmed." Tu Tien closed her eyes and let out a breath that undead almost like a sob. For a few seconds, she could not speak. Relief hit her so hard that it hurt. The doctor, however, did not soften the rest of the message. "You were lucky," she said firmly. "You cannot keep living like this. You are pregnant, and your body is already carrying a great deal. If you continue pushing yourself this hard, the next situation may not be so forgiving. You need proper rest. You need food, sleep, and less emotional strain. I understand that your life may be difficult right now, but if you do not slow down, both you and the baby could be at risk." Those words stayed with Tu Tien long after the doctor left the room. She lay back against the pillow and stared into silence, one hand resting over her stomach. The baby was all right. For now, that should have brought her peace. And in some ways, it did. But it also left her with a sharper fear than before. For the first time, the danger felt real in a different way. Until now, she had been worried. Now she understood she had truly come close to pushing herself too far. That evening, the lawyer came to see her. He had been trying to reach her for hours before finally hearing what happened. When he stepped into the room, his expression was serious. But there was something else in it too, urgency. "I have an update," he said. Tu Tien looked up immediately, her tiredness forgotten for a moment. "What happened?" she asked. The lawyer took a breath before answering. "The investigators have made an important breakthrough. They've begun confirming that the person most directly responsible for the bridge collapse was Phuc." Tu Tien stared at him. For a second, the words did not fully register. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. "I mean the evidence is becoming clearer," the lawyer said. "The police have traced material substitutions, altered internal records, missing verification steps, and payment trails. Most of it is now leading directly back to Phuc. It doesn't erase the fact that Jack is still under investigation as the company head, but it changes the direction of the case." Tu Tien's heart began pounding. "So, Jack..." The lawyer nodded slowly. "There is now a strong possibility he may be released on bail or allowed to remain outside custody while the investigation continues." Tears filled Tu Tien's eyes almost instantly. Not because everything was solved, not because Jack had been fully cleared, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, the darkness in front of her seemed to crack just enough to let in a little light. "When?" she asked. "That depends on the police and the prosecutor's handling of the next step," the lawyer answered. "But this new finding is significant. The investigators are no longer treating the responsibility as equally unclear. They are starting to distinguish between the person who directly caused the collapse and the people around him." Tu Tien lowered her head and pressed a hand over her mouth, trying to contain the flood of emotion rising inside her. The baby was safe. Jack might be released. For the first time in days, she felt hope and fear colliding inside her at the same time. Later that night, lying alone in the hospital bed, she could not stop thinking about him. Was he still being questioned at that very moment? Did he know the investigation was beginning to shift? Did he know Phuc's role was becoming clearer? Did he know that she had collapsed and ended up in the hospital? That last thought hurt the most. She had not told him yet, and she did not know whether she should. Part of her wanted to keep it from him, at least until he was stronger, at least until there was less uncertainty around his own situation. But another part of her knew Jack too well. If he found out later that she had been hospitalized and had hidden it from him, the guilt would destroy him. The next morning, she was still weak, but more stable. Her color had returned a little, and her breathing no longer felt as heavy as before. The doctor reminded her again that she had to rest properly and stop forcing herself to carry everything alone. Then, just before noon, the lawyer returned with another update. This time, his face carried cautious relief. "Jack has been released for now," he said. "He's not fully cleared. The investigation is still ongoing, and he may still be called in again at any time, but the police have allowed him to remain outside while they continue examining the case." Tu Tien felt tears rush to her eyes again. Released, not free, not safe, not finished, but released. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. "Does he know I'm here?" she asked. The lawyer hesitated just briefly. "He knows now." That one sentence sent a chill through her. She could already imagine Jack's face the moment he heard she had collapsed from exhaustion and been admitted to the hospital while he was still being held. Relief at being released would not be the first thing he felt. Guilt would, and love, and fear. Tu Tien closed her eyes, one hand resting over her stomach once more, and in that quiet hospital room, only one question rose in her heart. Would Jack be able to return in time to care for her and the baby? Or would this unfinished investigation drag them all back into another nightmare before they even had the chance to breathe? When Jack stepped out after being released, the first thing he felt was not relief. It was guilt. The air outside should have felt different after days of being held for investigation. The sky was open. The road was no longer blocked by walls and questions, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could walk without an officer guiding every movement. But none of that gave him peace, because by the time he was allowed out, he had already learned the one thing that cut deeper than every question the police had asked him. Tu Tien had collapsed from exhaustion and been admitted to the hospital. The moment the lawyer told him, Jack went silent. For a second, he could not even process the rest of the explanation. The baby was safe. The doctor had said there was no sign of harm. Tu Tien needed rest. The investigation had shifted because the police were now identifying Phuc as the one most directly responsible for the bridge collapse. Jack had been released only because the authorities were beginning to separate Phuc's direct actions from Jack's failure and supervision. But all of that came after the only thing Jack could hear clearly. Tu Tien had collapsed, and he had not been there. The ride to the hospital felt endless. He sat in silence, his jaw tight, his hands clenched, staring ahead without really seeing anything. The lawyer sitting beside him tried to explain the latest developments again, the evidence leading to Phuc, the material substitutions, the altered records, the missing technical verification steps. But Jack barely responded. His mind was already in the hospital room. He imagined Tu Tien alone, pale, exhausted, carrying their child while trying to hold together everything outside. He thought about the fear she must have felt when she woke up under hospital lights, wondering first about the baby before anything else. He thought about how hard she had been pushing herself while he was trapped inside, powerless to stop her. And the more he thought about it, the heavier the guilt became. By the time he reached the hospital, his heartbeat was so hard and uneven that it almost hurt. When he stepped into the room, Tu Tien was sitting up against the pillow. Her face still looked pale, and the tiredness in her eyes had not disappeared. But the moment she saw him, something in her expression changed. For a second, neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other. Jack looked thinner and more worn than when she had last seen him. His face carried the strain of the days he had spent under investigation, and his eyes were darker than before. But he was here. Not behind a door, not across a guarded table. Here. Tu Tien's lips trembled slightly. Jack moved toward her quickly, then slowed down at the bedside as if he was suddenly afraid even his presence might be too heavy. His eyes went first to her face, then immediately to the hand resting over her stomach. "You should have told me," he said softly. The words were quiet, but filled with emotion. Tu Tien gave a faint, tired smile. "I was going to." Jack shook his head, his voice lower now. "You collapsed. You ended up in the hospital, and I was not there." Tu Tien watched him carefully. Even after everything he had gone through, even after being held and questioned for days, the first thing filling his space now was not anger, not relief, not even shock. It was pain for her. "The baby is okay," she said gently. "The doctor said the baby is okay." Jack closed his eyes for 1 second, and when he opened them again, they were full of relief and fear at the same time. "I know," he said. "The lawyer told me. But that doesn't change what happened." He pulled a chair closer and sat down beside her bed, still looking at her as if he needed to confirm she was truly in front of him. Tu Tien reached for his hand. The moment her fingers touched his, the wall he had been holding up around himself seemed to loosen. "I'm sorry," he said. Tu Tien frowned immediately. Why are you apologizing? Because while I was inside, you were out here carrying everything alone. The case, the company, the fear, the pregnancy, everything. His voice tightened. And you pushed yourself until your body gave out. Tu Tien squeezed his hand lightly. I didn't do it because I wanted to be reckless. I know. I did it because there was no choice. That hurt him most because it was true. Jack lowered his head for a moment, staring at their hands. There should have been another way. But there wasn't, Tu Tien said softly. Not then. Silence settled between them for a moment. But it was not the same silence as before. It was no longer the silence of separation and distance. It was the silence of two people finally in the same place again, trying to understand how much had changed. After a while, Jack asked, "What did the doctor say exactly?" Tu Tien knew why he asked. He needed details. Something concrete, something he could hold on to instead of fear. She said I was lucky, Tu Tien answered honestly. The baby wasn't harmed. But she also said I cannot keep living like this. Too much stress, too much work, too little rested can become dangerous. Jack's face tightened again. And you're going to listen to her, he said immediately. The firmness in his voice almost made her smile. You still sound like you think I argue too much. I still know you do. That finally drew a real small smile from her. But it faded quickly when the larger reality returned. Jack was out, yes, but not free. The investigation was still open. His release did not mean the case had ended. It only meant the police had begun to identify Fook as the one who most directly caused the collapse. There were still questions about company oversight, responsibility, and whether Jack could have prevented what happened if he had been stricter or more involved in the final stages. Jack seemed to sense where her thoughts were going, because after a pause, he spoke quietly. A knot cleared. Tu Tien looked at him. I know. They can still call me back at any time. They can still investigate more. This is not over. I know that too. Jack studied her face. Then why are you looking at me like that? Tu Tien's eyes softened. Because even if it's not over, you're here. And right now, that matters. Those words settled deeply into him. For the first time since the bridge collapse, Jack felt something he had not allowed high. Self to feel in days, not safety, not certainty, but the beginning of steadiness. He turned his hand and held hers more firmly. From now on, you do not handle everything alone. Tu Tien raised an eyebrow slightly. And how exactly are you planning to stop me? Jack actually let out the faintest breath of a laugh. It was tired and brief, but real. By being there, he said, for whatever I still can be. That answer touched her more than he knew. After a long moment, Tu Tien asked the question she had been carrying since the lawyer told her he had been released. What happened with the investigation? Jack leaned back slightly and exhaled. They've traced too much of it back to Fuck now. The supplier changes, the missing verification steps, the document trail, enough that they can no longer treat his role as unclear. And you? Jack's face grew heavy again. They believe I failed as the company head. They believe I trusted too much, watched too little, and let too much pass through internal channels without proper control. Tu Tien was quiet. Because that part, painful as it was also true. Jack continued, his voice lower now, but they're beginning to separate that from direct intent. That's why I'm out. Not because I'm innocent in every way, but because the one who caused the collapse most directly is becoming clearer. Fuck. Even hearing the name in silence felt bitter between them. The young man who had once stood beside Jack on the bridge site, speaking with confidence and enthusiasm, had now become the center of everything that destroyed them. The bridge collapse, the scandal, the detention, the fear, the hospital. Tu Tien placed a hand over her stomach again without thinking. Jack noticed immediately. Are you in pain? he asked. She shook her head. No, just tired. Jack's expression changed at once. Then you rest, no more arguments. Tu Tien gave him a soft look. You just got out and you're already giving orders. I'm serious, I know. She really did know. Underneath his firmness was fear. He had nearly lost too much all at once. He could not bear the idea of losing more. For a while, they sat quietly together. Outside the window, the afternoon light had started to soften. The room was still, almost peaceful, which made the storm outside their little space feel even stranger. The case was still open. The future was still uncertain. Public opinion had not changed overnight. The company was still broken. But inside that hospital room, for the first time in what felt like forever, they were sitting side by side again. That mattered more than either of them could say. Eventually, Tu Tien turned to him and asked the question that had been living in her heart ever since she heard he was being released. Will they really let you stay outside, or will they take you back again? Jack was quiet for a moment before answering. I don't know, he said honestly. It depends on what else they find. It depends on how the investigation develops. It depends on whether they believe I can still interfere with anything. He paused. But right now, I'm here. And while I'm here, I'm not wasting another moment. Tu Tien looked at him, her eyes filling again. Then she nodded slowly. Because that was all either of them had now. Not certainty, not freedom, not peace, only this moment. Jack reached up carefully and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. The gesture was so gentle that it nearly broke her all over again. You and the baby come first now, he said. Tu Tien's lips trembled into the smallest smile. We always should have, Jack nodded. You're right. And as the light faded slowly beyond the hospital window, only one question remained hanging quietly between them. Would the investigation finally end with Jack's freedom, or would this brief return only be a pause before another battle began?